All right, everyone. So I want to pick up where we left off today, which the last question, if you remember, that we left off during today's lecture, was how the Silk Roads began, right? And so we looked at how the Silk Roads began, and we said basically it was people's natural desires to kind of interact with zones and peoples and empires that had different things than they did, and that slowly but surely it ended up building kind of this network of transcontinental um, paths that connected Europe to Asia. And we once again said that the pastoral peoples of the interior were really kind of the linchpin. So let's take a look now at the question, when were the Silk Roads most used? So if we looked at history and we said, when was there the most traffic kind of moving along them? The simple answer is that the Silk Roads were used far and away most heavily when there were large states kind of along their path that were able to provide security, right? And so when we look here in the classical era that we just kind of left, when the Roman Empire was at its peak and the Chinese empires were at its peak, these empires basically knew that a lot of their money and a lot of their tax revenue and a lot of the money that they needed to sustain their empire was generated by trade. And so they didn't mess around with making sure that trade could happen safely. They knew that, if they're not patrolling the trade routes, if they're not keeping them safe from merchants, then people aren't going to go very far. And when people don't go very far, they don't make a lot of money. The next height of the Silk Road was when it peaked was actually even more, right? Because in the classical era, you had the Roman in the west and the Chinese in the east, but the middle was largely still uncontrolled. But in the 7th and 8th centuries, we actually saw a string of large, powerful empires that were able to kind of connect all the way from east to west, creating this belt of super strong states that made it extremely safe to travel. You had the Byzantine Empire, which were basically the inheritors of Rome. You had the Abbasid Caliphate, which was the Islamic Empire in the Middle East and kind of Central Asia. And then you had the Tang Dynasty, which was one of China's most powerful dynasties. And this continued all the way until the 13th and 14th centuries, when the Mongols managed to create the largest land empire in the history of humanity, right? Which is they created an empire that stretched all the way from China in the east all the way to Eastern Europe in the west. They controlled the whole dang thing. And again, these empires had great incentive to make sure that the trade routes were safe, right? In fact, most famously, let's take the Mongols, who knew that their entire empire was being sustained on the back of trade. And so, honest, like what they did in order to ensure it was basically, if they caught you stealing, if they caught you robbing, if they caught you doing illegal activities along their trade routes, their standard form of punishment, and I kid you not, was to basically take people, lie them on the ground, tie ropes to each one of their arms and legs, attach that rope to one of their, many strong horses. Again, they were pastoral people, horse-going people. Tie those ropes to horses, and then basically whip the horses until each one of them had pulled your arms and legs off your body. Now, how many times do you think they had to do that before criminals sort of got the message that it's not a good idea to mess with the Mongols, right? And they took it very seriously, as did all the other empires. And so when these states came along and provided the safety and the security, then business and trade along these routes like trap or thrived. So let's also take a look about what goods, because we're going to look at the same question as it relates to the Indian Ocean Trade Network on Monday. What goods traveled on the Silk Road? And like I said earlier, right, the goods that pass along trade routes did a lot of things, right? They supported empires, they provided social standing for rich people, like think purple fabric or other luxury items that gave rich people their status. But plain and simple, these goods possessed huge economic and social importance. And generally speaking, because you're only talking about wagons and loaded camels on the Silk Road, you really had to get the maximum bang for your buck, right? Like you were not going to be making a whole lot of money if you got your wagon out and you took the road, but you packed your wagon full of like rutabagas, right? Like you could take those rutabagas 100 miles and unload them, and you're really not making much of a profit, right? But instead of kind of what we call staple goods, right? Like food stuff, like wheat or rice or rutabagas, what if you packed your wagons or your camels filled with luxury goods like silks or spices or tea or porcelain or jewels or tortoise shells or all these like elite things like furs from jaguars, right? These luxury goods made it so that you could actually make an enormous profit because the transport was so expensive to do, so risky to do, that the only way you were going to make a return on your risk was to make it sure that what you were actually trading was important enough to kind of net you a major profit, right? Like cabbage was not going to get it done. Um, you would also basically is very common for people to sell the animals at the end of their journey, right? Because these animals, these domesticated animals from these pastoral inland empires, were oftentimes sold to the agricultural empires on the end for war supporting or farming purposes. And obviously silk, right, gave its name. Now, fun story about silk. Up until the 6th century, the Chinese actually had a monopoly on it. They closely guarded the secret of the silk. And even within Chinese society, there was a guild of silk producers. And the only people that knew how it was produced were people that were within the guild. And it was so important in order to safeguard this secret that the Chinese basically are on record that if they discovered that you had spilled the beans, like let's say one night you went out to the bar and had a little bit too much to drink, and then suddenly you're bragging about these worms that are basically pooping these threads that you could weave into this beautiful luxurious silk fabric. Um, the punishment for spilling the beans on silk was not just the killing of you, but the killing of your entire family, right? And this was the significance of silk. It was so valuable because it was this elusive item that only the Chinese knew how to produce, and they knew that if the secret ever got out and people realized it was just worms feeding on mulberry leaves, that their monopoly would be ruined and their profits would go down. And so, fun story there, kind of morbid. But and this is a term we're going to talk about a lot, which is what is a trade imbalance. A trade imbalance is essentially when like you have something that people want so much that you're willing to give the good in exchange for them giving gold or their wealth. And so you're getting richer and the other people are simply getting stuff, right? This is a trade imbalance, right? When you're getting richer and other people are just getting stuff, this is a trade imbalance. And so, Rome loved silk so much and used it as a symbol of supporting the emperors, right, in the elite classes, that Rome was actually on record of sending a significant portion of its wealth along the Silk Road in order to get silk. So China is getting richer and Rome is getting fabric, right? And now, after the 6th century, the secret finally got out, and other people started getting in the silk production game, like the Byzantines and the Persians and India. So it did eventually get out, but as I said, major status symbol, to the point where in China it was so carefully regulated that only people like cultural elites, people in the government or large landowners, were actually allowed to wear it. And if you got caught wearing silk as an imposter, right? You were basically charged with pretending to be somebody you weren't, like actually, and you were forced into slavery as punishment. Um, it was part of sacred traditions in Buddhism and Christianity, and so this one small little good moving back and forth along the Silk Road had enormous significance socially and culturally with religions. Like these were the robes that the priests of Catholicism would wear on, Easter and feast days and things like that. Um, and then next, obviously, and this is perhaps the most important thing, is that in addition to the goods traveling on the Silk Road, we also saw a significant number of ideas and inventions, right? Gunpowder was the most famous. This was originally, a chemistry product in China, mostly used for recreation and enjoyment through fireworks. And then, you get in the hands of the bloodthirsty Europeans, and suddenly they're like, dang, this thing, we could use this to kill people real efficiently. The magnetic compass was hugely important because it transformed how we took to the open ocean. That came from China and moved along the Silk Road, changing human exploration, and ultimately was a piece of technology that allowed European exploration and discovery of the New World with Columbus. Movable type emerged out of Buddhist monasteries. It was basically like stamps, right? They had like a stamp for each letter, and you could arrange the letters in order and then rub ink on them and produce really quickly 100 copies in what would have taken you the amount of time to handwrite it. And so these three inventions especially were of critical importance to human history because of their impact. Movable type allowed information to be kind of distributed faster. No longer books were not just for rich people. Magnetic compass opened up the doors for exploration. Gunpowder changed the face of modern warfare. All moved along the Silk Road from China. So now let's take a look at what influence the Silk Road had on Buddhism. Um, and in addition to ideas and inventions and all of that, we also saw that cultural transmission along the Silk Roads was arguably even more important. And when I say cultural transmissions, I mean a lot of things. But for this particular chapter, we want to focus in on Buddhism. We're going to be seeing later in this chapter that along the Indian Ocean trade networks is mostly the movement of Islam, which we're going to get to in the next chapter. But Islam moved along the Indian Ocean trade networks, but Buddhism was mostly associated with the Silk Road, right? Buddhism emerged out of northern India, moved along the Silk Roads until it got into China, ultimately crossed into Japan and Korea. But Buddhism, as we are going to see, when religions move and when religions are kind of like, traded, so to speak, they also change. Um, because religions tend to absorb ideas in various places where they move, right? We know that Buddhism has always appealed to merchants, especially um, for a lot of reasons. Number one, because Buddhism didn't demonize merchants like Chinese Confucianism did. Number two, because the Buddhist monasteries had set up a lot of almost like way stations or rest stops along the Silk Road for weary travelers who just made it through the desert to, stop their caravan and take a break, right? And get some care and rest up before the next journey. And so these Buddhist monasteries kind of built along the Silk Road, they ended up getting donations from these merchants themselves, and these donations basically were fueled to build the size of the monasteries, spread Buddhist teachings. Um, and so Buddhism changed a lot along the Silk Road and spread very heavily to the point that a lot of Central Asian cities actually became centers of Buddhist learning, right? Massive monasteries and, a lot of Buddhist scrolls and writings. Um, as I said, the monasteries became rest stops. Um, and we're going to see a lot of different things in this chapter as evidence points for this. Like you see these massive rock carvings of the Buddha in the side of mountainsides in Central Asia. And, it's some really sad stories there is these are massive historical, awesome 1,000-year olds, like 200 feet carvings of the Buddha in the side of the mountains. And the Taliban, when they took over Afghanistan in the 1980s, actually destroyed a lot of them, right? Like blew them up because they felt like it was anti-Islam. Um, Now we do know that that Buddhism spread slower amongst the Central Asian nomads. Central Asian, like nomads in general, tend to lack a written language. The lack of a written language made it harder to spread certain religions that really relied on it. Christianity would have been one, right? Like if you don't have a written language, you can't pass on the Bible. Um, Buddhism was another language that really, or another religion that really relied on written language Islam, on the other hand, was an oral tradition. And so we're going to see Islam